Okay, so I guess I can just start now. Um,
Ma'am Ting,
Doctor.
let's just wait for a
oh,
while
okay.
for the other attendees.
Okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Welcome to the attendees. So we are about to start in a few minutes. For the others, if you know someone who signed up for the event and still is not yet here in the Zoom room, can you do us a favor and inform them that we are about to start? Thank you.
So I think we can begin the program now. So good morning, dear students, colleagues, and friends. Welcome to the 2021 Ethics 1 guest lectures. This year's theme is Asian Ethical Frameworks. Last year's theme, which is Applied Ethics, uh, also emanates from the spirit and letter of Ethics 1 as a GE subject in the UP system and the GE framework it is based on. Okay. So the course description of Ethics 1 states that the GE ethics will locate the sources of moral experience, not only within culture, society, religion, and individual experiences, but also in your relations with nature. This emphasis on local sources of moral reasoning and valuation is also echoed in the GE framework, which states that the UPGE program is a transformative education enabling and encouraging students to take creative and constructive action that contributes to the improvement of their community, the nation, and the world, based on a strong sense of their cultural and historical identity, as well as a sense of a shared humanity. The discipline of philosophy of UP Baguio thus believes that inviting guest philosophers whose expertise lie in Asian ethics and Asian philosophy in general is in keeping with deepening and sustaining this imperative to converse and problematize the centrality of our identity and our local context in ethical discourse. And so without further ado, let me introduce or let us welcome our facilitator for the AM session, Ma'am Andrea Nicole Fabregas, who will also introduce our guest lecturer for this morning's session. Ma'am Andy.
Well, thank you, Sir Lad. Okay, to proceed with our event, let me first introduce our first guest lecturer. So, our first guest lecturer, she is currently a lecturer in Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Philosophy. She specializes in Chinese philosophy, and among her area of competence are psychoanalysis, semiotics, aesthetics, complexity philosophy, and social philosophy. She obtained her undergraduate degree from the University of Santo Tomas. For her master's degree, which she received from the same university, she worked on the thesis project entitled The Primacy of Wu and the Unity of Heaven, Earth, and Man, a humanist reading of the Zhou Yi as commented on by Wang Bi. And very recently, just last week, she successfully defended her dissertation entitled Freedom as Self-Realization in Guo Xiang's Neo-Taoist Philosophy, and thereby received her doctorate degree in philosophy from the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. We are very grateful to have you here, streaming all the way from Singapore, Dr. Christine Abigail Tan. Ma'am, you're on mute po. Ayan,
Thank you,
okay.
Andrea. Thank you to UP Baguio as well for inviting me. So today I'm going to talk about the cultured man as a noble man. So this is one of the or several Confucian virtues. And I guess just a little disclaimer, it's this is one of my earlier works where so this is one of my earlier works where I work on Confucianism. Nowadays, I specialize more on Neo-Taoism, which is Taoism and like an amalgamation of Taoism and Confucianism in medieval Chinese era. So my research is on quite an esoteric and niche, very niche field in Chinese philosophy. But generally, I am very interested in like the harmony and amalgamation, as well as synergy of different concepts or seemingly opposing concepts in not only Chinese philosophy, but in philosophy in general. So this is one of those works, and maybe I guess it would be kind of helpful to keep that in mind. Another interest of mine, or another topic in Confucianism that interests me, is how something like Li or ritual and propriety, often seen as something that's inflexible or fixed, can be natural and spontaneous. And that's something that that you could see throughout my work. It's a common strand throughout my work that I try to combine or amalgamate and syncretize these two or two seemingly opposing concepts. So without further ado, my aim in this talk. All right, so before I talk about my aim though, so I just want to talk a little bit about ritual and propriety. And ritual and propriety, it's Li in Chinese or in classical Chinese. It's often viewed by modern minds or us in modernity as having a tendency to be empty tradition, binds us or limits our capabilities, especially in a generation which celebrates the creation of oneself as an art form. So, for example, you see in thinkers like Nietzsche, among other counter Enlightenment thinkers, that dominate the trends of contemporary society, the creation of the self as a kind of art form. Now, from the Confucian perspective, however, it does the exact opposite, which is to widen one's horizon or consciousness and thus capabilities as well. So one can't help but wonder, therefore, just how following ancient, even outdated traditions can possibly be a virtue, right? What what does this matter of culture, commonly understood as something that's amoral, sometimes even meta-ethical, have to do with becoming a good citizen of the state or becoming a good human being? Yet, the virtue of Li, or ritual and propriety, is one among the five primary Confucian virtues. So, if you've studied Confucianism or basic Confucianism before, you know that Li is one of the five basic Confucian virtues, or even among the three more primary Confucian virtues. The other two I will also discuss, which is Ren, or benevolence, or humaneness, and Yi, which is righteousness. And so my argument here is that the nobleman, or what we call the Chunzi in Confucianism, embodies Li the most. So therefore, my aim in this talk is to show the relation between Ren and Li, being that Li is the main manifestation of Ren in its concreteness, but which is made possible by the concept of Yi. Now, this interplay between Ren and Yi, which finds which finds its harmony in Li. Sorry. So this interplay between Ren and Yi, which finds its harmony in Li, as I will try to show, can be found in the Lunyu to be embodied by the Chunzi. So in order to do this, we will first talk about the importance of Ren, its immediacy and immanence. Again, Ren is translated as humaneness, so Ren means humaneness. Its immediacy and immanence, as well as to show the two aspects of Ren, which is Chong and Shu, which I will also talk about later. Bear with me with the Chinese words. And then I will show the implication of Yi in Chong and Shu, which are also parts of humaneness or Ren, coming to the conclusion that Yi is therefore an external, or righteousness is therefore an external moral ought, while Ren is an internal motivation for goodness. So finally, I will deal with the notion of Li as the concrete manifestation of the previous two virtues, which is Ren and Yi, where the compassion of Ren and the unflinching discipline of Yi find their perfect harmony. Therefore, I do that so that I could demonstrate to embody the Ren and Yi. So I guess at this point, it would be important to take note of the translations of Ren, Yi, and Li, because I'm going to refer to them in Chinese, since I don't think that there is an appropriate English word to translate these concepts, although there are very near translations. I don't think that translating them to like a single identifier would do them justice. So I would refer to them continually henceforth as Ren, Yi, and Li. So it would be helpful for you to take note that Ren is kind of like humaneness, and Li is ritual and propriety, and then Yi is similar to what we understand as righteousness or moral virtue. So first and foremost, we have run, and this is often translated, and this is often considered as the most important virtue of Confucian virtues, and it's commonly translated as simply virtue or fundamental goodness, true goodness, benevolence, or quite idiosyncratically, as we see in Roger Ames, he translates it as authoritative conduct, which connotes the firm and steadfast nature of how one's character should be. Now, Ren is regarded as even more important than life itself. And the master said, if a man sets his heart on benevolence, he will be free of evil. Hold on. Bear with me. Okay, so the master said that if a man sets his heart on benevolence, he will be free from evil. In other words, Ren comes at the helm, serving as a shield from all malevolence that threatens to sully the character of he who possesses the virtue of Ren. And furthermore, the master says, and this is a quote from the Analects as well, the gentleman never deserts benevolence, not even for as long as it takes to eat a meal. If he hurries and stumbles, one may be sure that it is benevolence that he does so, end of quote. So that's from the Analects. And in other words, when one has become aware of Run, it can no longer be undone nor erased from one's character. The essence of Run, however, is perhaps highlighted through the verse in the Lunyu, which reads, and I quote, it is man who is capable of broadening the way. It is not the way that is capable of broadening man. And that's something, that quote right there, that it is man who is capable of broadening the way, is something that's very interesting and quite differentiates it from Taoism, because it's very humanistic, it's very anthropocentric, it's very, it highlights the power of man a lot. So such is this, humanist foundation of the moral philosophy of Confucius. It looks at man as the locus of unity between heaven and earth. This saying of the master is fleshed out in the rest of the Lunyu, or the saying of Confucius is fleshed out in the rest of the Lunyu, and is mostly seen in the virtue of Ren. It is derived from the root words Ren, meaning, so here you have, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, probably not. So the word on the right, on the left, is derived from the word Ren, meaning man. And the word on the right, so the two lines there, is number 2 in Chinese. So this suggests that human beings are irreducibly social and can only exist by coexisting. So next I want to talk about the actual anthropocentricity of Ren. And if Ren has no fixed definition in the Lunyu, it is because Ren, as Ames, or Roger Ames and Henry Rosemont would note here, they say that it is a qualitative transformation of a particular person. So it changes for every person. It's a qualitative transformation of any particular person at any given moment in time. Indeed, it's more like a process of becoming rather than having a fixed formula. Furthermore, in the Lunyu, the master said, is benevolence really far away? No sooner do I desire it than it is here. End of quote. Because what is internal is that which is most accessible, and for Confucian philosophy in particular, must become evident in praxis, and as such becomes the measurement through which one can know others. Another passage in the Lunyu, which goes like this, is when Zhixia said, learn, and I quote, learn widely and be steadfast in your purpose. Inquire earnestly and reflect on what is at hand, and there is no need for you to look for benevolence elsewhere. Run, end of quote. So run is thus humaneness that is not simply in theory, but concrete and imminent, even firm and unrelenting. The anthropological bent can be further seen in more passages in the Lunyu, when the master said that it is enough that the language one uses gets the point across. So that's a very apt analogy, as the master did not want to deal with unnecessary hair splitting and believed that the only wisdom which mattered was that which is communicable. So it is with Run, in that if one is good inside, then it must show in one's deeds. It must be, therefore, concrete. Moreover, it is said that, and I quote, the topics that the master did not speak of were prodigies, force, disorder, and God. So it's very humanistic in that sense. The master believed that whatever is out there or external, so there's this saying in Chinese which goes like outside the six forces. That means like outside the world, outside what is observable or empirically observable, Confucius did not talk about. So for them, he believed that whatever is out there, whatever we cannot observe, cannot be known by man. For even that which is here is not yet understood by man, and so deserves more focus. That said, we see that Run, in order to be fully manifest or to be actualized, must be seen or communicated. And this is done only through the practice of Li, as I will later on talk about more. The importance of which is particularly highlighted when Confucius said that guide them by the edicts, keep them in line with punishments, and the common people will stay out of trouble, but will have no sense of shame. So he's saying here, guide them by law, use punishments, and petty men will actually be guided by fear, but they will have no sense of shame. And that's ultimately what you want. You have to guide them by virtue. Instead of like laws and punishments, Confucius says that we must guide people by virtue instead, and keep them in line with the rites, or with Li, with ritual and propriety. And they will, besides having a sense of shame themselves, they will reform themselves and they will want to actually become better people. Now, the anthropocentricity of Ren can be seen in what Confucius calls Chong and Shu. So according to Feng Yulan, who is a very famous sinologist, one of the most prominent ones, there are two aspects of Ren, he says. And I quote, this is a quote from Feng Yulan, the practice of Ren consists in consideration for others. And then he quotes the Analects, desiring to sustain oneself, one sustains others. Desiring to develop oneself, one develops others. In other words, and this is another quote directly from the Analects, do to others what you wish yourself, end of quote. This is the positive aspect of the practice, which is called by Confucius as Chong, or conscientiousness to others. So Chong is conscientiousness to others. And the negative aspect, which was called by Confucius Shu, which is altruism. So do not do, and this is another quote in the Analects, according to Confucius, Shu highlights the fact that, or the predicament of not doing to others what you do not wish to yourself. Now, the practice as a whole is called the principle of Chong and Shu, which is the way to practice Run. Moreover, Feng Yulan maintains, and we see here in the first bullet point, that this principle of applying a measuring square is a principle wherein one uses himself in order to be able to gauge his own conduct. Now, Chong is often translated simply as loyalty and faithfulness, and James Legge If you look at C-text, the most widely available translation online, James Legg in particular translates it as faithfulness or devotion of soul. But a more apt translation of Chong, I think, is found in DC Lao's translation of a verse in Lunyu where the master says, make it your guiding principle to do your best for others. That is, again, according to Feng Yulan, consensuousness to others. So this directly supports Feng Yulan's claim that Chong is indeed the positive aspect of Ren, that is the more active aspect. Now, the negative aspect of Ren is Shu. Now, on the other hand, is also reflected in Lun Yu when, and I quote, Zhu Gong asked, is there a single word which can be a guide to conduct throughout one's life? And the master responded, he said, it is perhaps the word shu. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. End of quote. Now, one notices here that whether zhong or shu, positive or negative, active or passive, both are treated as a supreme virtue. Because both aspects of Ren, which, as we previously mentioned, consists of the most important Confucian virtue. Now, this claim is cemented by one of the most often cited passages in the Lonyu, where Confucius says, Chan, there is one single thread binding my way together. And Zhengzi assented. Now, after the master had gone out, the disciples asked, what did he mean? And Zhengzi said, the way of the master consists in doing one's best and in using oneself as a measure to gauge others. That is all. And this is that quote in Analects chapter 4, verse 15. And here, so you see in the Chinese, it says 父子之道, the way of the master. Zhong is Chong and Shu. So those are the highlighted words here, Chong and Shu. And here he says, yi. That's it. So Chong and Shu is the way of the master. That's it. Now, that is indeed all, but the phrase one single thread binding my way together presupposes, or 知道, presupposes a system wherein the philosophy of the master is built upon. And at its core, according to the verse, is Chong and Shu. Now, this is none other than Ren. One should be careful, however, not to interpret this in a very literal sense, because Chong and Shu are also guided by Yi, or moral righteousness, moral virtue, or righteousness. Now, the sinologist, my former supervisor and mentor, Alfredo Ko, in his book Philosophy of Ancient China, The Blooming of 100 Flowers, there he says that Yi is implied in Chong and Shu. There he says that Yi is implied in Chong and Shu through zhengming, or the rectification of names. Now, there's a quote in the Analects here in 13 verse 3. So the master said, it's quite long, that's why I put it in the slide here. That is, he says that the master said, if something has to be put first, it is perhaps the rectification or the zheng of names. Zilu said, is that so? What a roundabout way you take. Why bring rectification at all? Now the master said, Yu, how boorish you are. Where a gentleman is ignorant, one would expect him not to offer any opinion. When names are not correct, what is said will not sound reasonable. When what is said does not sound reasonable, affairs will not culminate in success. When affairs do not culminate in success, rights in music will not flourish. When rights in music do not flourish, punishments will not fit the crimes. When punishments do not fit the crimes, the common people will not know where to put hand and foot. Thus, when the gentleman names something, the name is sure to be usable in speech. And when he says something, this is sure to be practicable. The thing about the gentleman is that he is anything but casual where speech is concerned. You mean what you say and you say what you mean, in other words. So this again further supports that Ren as a very foundation of the Confucian moral system, where Chong is being true to one's principle and truth is manifested, where the firmness of E is indeed implied. So, however, my contention is that E is also implied in Shu, even if simply on account of Shu being a guiding principle towards which we must strive, albeit through restraint, still moral restraint, righteousness through moral restraint. So what I'm trying to arrive at really is that E, or righteousness or moral rightness, is an external ideal which guides our moral actions, made possible by such two aspects of Ren. Now E, E, let's go now to the concept of E. And here we see that if Ren is self-transformation, it takes its form from the moral ought, that is E. In the Lunyu, the master said, for gentlemen, it is morality, for the gentleman, or for the Chunzi, it is morality that is supreme. Possessed of courage, but devoid of morality, a gentleman will make trouble, while a small man will be a brigand. Indeed, if Ren is the internal motivation for goodness, E is the ontological yet external ideal, the universal moral of Ren towards which Li, ritual or propriety, as we'll later discuss, directs its particular acts. Of the Chunzi, the master said, in his dealings, here you see it in the last bullet point, in his dealings with the world, the gentleman is not invariably for or against anything. He is on the side of what is moral. So here in this passage, we can see that this affirms the thesis that Ren has no fixed definition nor function, but rather a process which allows for the practice of Li, according to what is E, in the context of uniqueness and singularity of each situation and particular circumstance. Moreover, it asserts E as a constant and universal idea or universal ideal or righteousness, or more aptly, rightness, upon which Li or propriety is modeled upon. In his article on E as a universal principle of specific application in Confucian morality, that's the title of Cheng Chong-Ying's article, he claims that E gives unity to all virtues and creates more when needed, thus directing what is appropriate for specific situations as an ordering principle which generates specific actions. So like Ren, Cheng argues that it is a common sentiment to all men rooted from Ren. And so, whereas Ren is internal, E is external. E transforms the world into a world of self, according to Cheng. Because it is when the subjective act assumes objective validity. So acting out Ren in its moral rightness is when a subjective act assumes objective validity. A passage in the Lunyu which affirms this is when he says, the master said, so you see this in the second bullet point, if it is these things that cause me concern, failure to cultivate virtue, failure to go more deeply into what I have learned, inability when I am told what is right to move to where it is, and inability to reform myself when I have defects, end of quote. So here we notice that the master talks about cultivating Ren, which is deeply within, while E, or that which is right, is mentioned as something to move to in order to reform oneself. That is, E is depicted as something outside of man, but towards which he must strive as an ideal of moral perfection, an imperative for moral action. That is, if paired by Ren and refined by Li, required for a community to prosper, have peace and order. And so it is also noted in the Lonyu in a passage, and I quote, "When Fanshu left, the master said, 'How petty Fanshu is. When those above love, when those above love their rights, none of the common people will dare be irreverent. When they love what is right, none of the common people will dare be insubordinate. When they love trustworthiness, none of the common people will dare be insincere. In this way, the common people from the four quarters will come with their children strapped on their backs. What need is there to talk about growing crops?' We go back, therefore, to when the master said it is man who is capable of broadening the way, and it is not the way which is capable of broadening man. So if you will remember that passage. Moreover, now in a new light, we see that with the passage, and again, I quote, "The gentleman understands what is moral. The small man understands what is profitable." So that's the difference between in the analects, he often makes differentiation between 大人 and 小人, the big man or the superior man and the small man or the petty man. That is the educated person, one who is educated with what is right or what is right and wrong versus one who is not. And that's what goes on in that passage. He says that the gentleman understands what is moral, whereas the small man understands only what is profitable. And this is because, as we have previously mentioned, E is the capability to connect subjective actions, unique and situational, as well as circumstantial deeds, into a universal ought, which changes flexibility from situation to situation, in the same way that Li changes according to the situation. The small man, unable to rise to the universal level of E, only thinks of himself and therefore of personal profit. This is why the master said it is quite a remarkable feat for a group of men who are together all day long merely to indulge themselves in acts of petty cleverness without ever touching on the subject of morality in their conversation. E, therefore, we are at the last bullet point now. E, therefore, elevates the subjective, the particular, into the communal, and to be exposed to the community and the normative expectations of society without ever taking E into consideration would indeed be a shame, as it would lead to insubordination and chaos. Now, this elevation from personal to community or transformation of the world into a world of self, as previously mentioned, is again found in the Lonyu. And I quote, Zilu commented, "Not to enter public life is to ignore one's duty. Even the proper regulation of old and young cannot be set aside. How then can duty between ruler and subject be set aside? This is to cause confusion in the most important of human relationships, simply because one desires to keep unsullied one's character. The gentleman takes office in order to do his duty. As for putting the way into practice, he knows all along that it is hopeless." So, in other words, we see a very different kind of predicament or prescription in the Analects from most of postmodern thought or from Taoism as well, in that if you have the opportunity and you have the capability, according to Confucius, to actually take up office, and you know that you have the capability, then it is your responsibility to actually take up office, because if you don't, then it will fall into the hands of those who are incapable and only have profit in their minds. And so we can conclude that for the master, Ren finds no expression without E, for it is only through E where man is brought into a world where others truly exist and where there can be found an ontological moral given upon which Ren directs itself towards. Indeed, the master said, "Make it your guiding principle to do your best for others and to be trustworthy in what you say, and move yourself to where rightness or to where E is. then you will be exalting virtue. Now, to move towards E is to exalt virtue. And now this is in a more general or wider sense. In as we can see, in English, there's only one word. There's only virtue for like eat, run, because all of these are virtues. But da is a wider sense of virtue in classical Chinese. So here, moreover, moving on, the word used in Chinese for exalt here is Chong, which can also mean to worship, to hold high, or to honor. So all of which imply a movement of feeling towards a more superior realm. Now, this is because when E, as was previously claimed by, and we talked about, Chong Zhongying, pulls all other virtues into the objective realm. It's what makes them right. Now, E thus ensures that the moral deed is done, while Ren ensures that the motive is aligned. These two make two sides of the same coin, and therefore, just as Ren manifests itself in Li, E is the form upon which Li is expressed. Of the Zhunzi, the master said, the gentleman has morality as his basic stuff, and by observing the rites, puts it into practice. So the gentleman has morality or Ren as his basic stuff, and by observing the rites, observing Li, puts it into practice. By being modest, gives it expression, and by being trustworthy in word, brings it to completion. Such is the gentleman indeed. In other words, the gentleman, in other words, of this very position of Li, where it is the concrete manifestation of the harmony between Ren and Yi, as well as the Confucian anthropological and practical bent, is precisely what makes Li very important, despite common misconceptions of it as impractical or abstract rituals that are out there and without rational explanations. Now we move on to the concept of Li finally. And in Lin Yutang's work, The Wisdom of Confucius, there is a passage that I think is quite apt. And he says, he also quotes from the Analects, he says, is Li so very important as all that? And again, this is just a recounting of what we've already discussed, but in Lin Yutang's rendition, it is it's more highlighted. Li is more highlighted. Now, this Li, replied Confucius, is a principle by which the ancient kings embodied the laws of heaven and regulated the expressions of human nature. Therefore, he who has attained Li lives, and he who has lost it dies. Now, I would like to emphasize here how Li is a harmony of the embodiment of heavenly laws, as well as regulation, the medium for the expression of human nature. This passage from the Book of Rites suggests that the authenticity of a man consists of him in being a man of Li, which comes from both Ren and Yi. Li, however, despite referring to sacrificial rites, is, in the Confucian sense, largely humanistic and anthropological in nature. If it talks of any such higher order or heavenly canopy, at most, it is only inasmuch as Li, although manifested by Ren, takes its shape through the ontological moral given, thus the universe principle that is Yi, or righteousness. Now, again, to repeat a previously mentioned passage, Confucius said that the gentleman has morality as his basic stuff by observing the rites and puts it into practice. Now here we see the interconnection of Ren and Yi practiced into Li. And more importantly, however, is to establish the connection of Ren and Li, as we have already established the implied connection of Yi in the two aspects of Ren. Now, Li Chenyang, my supervisor, he wrote a paper called Li as Cultural Grammar on the relation between Li and Ren in Confucius in the Lunyun. Now, Li Chenyang uses the analogy of grammar and language in such a way that Li becomes culture or grammar, while Ren is mastery of culture. And this claim is sketched against a much controversial debate with regard to the relation between Li and Ren, as well as several claims on the interpretations of Li and Ren. My argument, however, is that it follows along the same path as Li Chenyang's interpretation, where he claims that Ren is flexible because Ren as mastery is more like an art, whereas Li as grammar becomes proper expression, but he uses quite a different analogy from me. Now, in other words, it's an instrumentalist claim broadly construed, wherein Li and Ren complement and need each other in order to function. Moreover, we see in the Lenyu and even in the Daxue several analogies, or Great Learning, several analogies of the virtues to a tree. And actually, it's not just in Confucius. A lot of ancient Chinese philosophies like to use trees and branches and roots as point for analogies. And again, just a quick sidebar. Sidebar. Even though I highlight here that Confucianism is very anthropocentric, you can see that even in their analogies they use nature, and it's also very naturalistic in this sense. And so, going back to our discussion, it is said in the Lenyu that the gentleman devotes his efforts to the roots, for once the roots are established, the way will grow therefrom. Being good, for example, being good as a son and obedient as a young man is perhaps the root of a man's character. Here we see that Ren is practiced becomes Li, and through Yi, in a web of interconnection, and in this particular case, takes on the concrete form of filial piety. So in this specific case, it is takes on the form of filial piety. Now, this analogy, as well as Li Chenyang's, are mostly supported by the following passages in the Lenyu. So there are several passages here. I'm going to just quote 3. The master said, "Why is it none of you, my young friends, study the Odes, or the Book of Rites?" An apt quotation from the Odes may serve to stimulate the imagination, to show one's breeding, to smooth over difficulties in a group, and to give expression to complaints. So that passage kind of shows how Confucius thinks that the Odes, shows somehow our collective consciousness and imaginations, that it can help us kind of find some roots or some commonalities for conversation when we talk about our differences and our commonalities, and might even give expression to our difficulties and complaints. Next, he says, "Surely, when one says the rites, it is not enough merely to mean presence of jade and silk. Surely, when one says music, it is not enough merely to mean bells and drums." So it is mostly the attitude and the meanings, and really the spirit, or if you want a contemporary term, the kind of the zeitgeist of these rites or of these practices and rituals. And another one, or lastly, the master also said that a cowardly man who puts on a brave face or puts on a brave front is, when compared to small men, like the burglar who breaks in or climbs over walls. So basically, it's kitsch and it shows. So Li, therefore, cannot exist in and of itself, but as it is simply not Li, which becomes empty without Ren. So from these passages, we know that, traditions also cannot exist on their own. They need to have substance, and their substance is Ren and Yi. And the master said, even with a true king, it is bound to take a generation for benevolence to become reality. And as Li Chenyang notes, He says that Ren cannot exist independently of Li, nor can one obtain Ren without Li. So we can't obtain humaneness or benevolence without actually respecting or without actually practicing it through propriety and rights. Because Li or propriety is embedded in the culture of which the person of Ren acquires mastery. In other words, without Li, there can be no culture for the person of Ren to master. This can again be traced back to the Lunyu when the master said, if a man be without virtues proper to humanity, what has he to do with the rights of propriety? If a man without virtues proper to humanity, if a man be without virtues proper to humanity, what has he to do with music? Ren and Li, therefore, are to be understood as interconnected, where Li is instrumental to the practice of Ren, and where Ren simply cannot function without Li as its guiding principle. Now, the master also said to return, sorry about that. So the master also said to return to the observance of the rights through overcoming the self constitutes benevolence. I will go back to this later, but again, this is a very interesting passage. To return to the observance of the rights through overcoming the self constitutes benevolence. Actually, I'll just a quick sidebar. That is very interesting to note, especially when in modern culture and in pop culture, we are often repeatedly told, find your true self, find your authentic self. And even in modern psychology, we are often told that we need to find our authentic self. You need to look within for your true self. This is not the case in Confucianism. And the case that Confucianism makes is to overcome yourself. It is precisely to overcome what you think is your true self, or your fixed identity, in order to become a better person or a better version of that Confucianism upholds. So, going back to the passage, he says, if for a single day a man could return to the observance of the rights through overcoming himself, then the whole empire would consider benevolence to be his. However, the practice of benevolence depends on oneself alone and not on others. Now, the master said, do not look unless it is in accordance with the rights. Do not listen unless it is in accordance with the rights. Do not speak unless it is in accordance with the rights, and do not move unless it is in accordance with the rights. End of quote. And Confucius himself was an example of this. He said, I set my heart on the way, base myself on virtue, lean upon benevolence for support, and take my recreation in the arts. Now, the permanence of Ren within a person is manifested in different ways among different situations. So that's very important to note, that its Li is never fixed. It's manifested in different ways, in different situations. And just as a tree's roots may grow in different and unique paths, a sentence may be differently phrased or structured in grammar for each situation, so is Li also relative. But Ren is unfettered, firm, and resolute. Your intentions and your virtue is firm and resolute. And Fanzhi asked about benevolence, and the master responded saying that, and I quote, while at home, hold yourself in a respectful attitude. When serving in an official capacity, be reverent. When dealing with others, do your best. These are the qualities that cannot be put aside even if you go and live among the barbarians. And therefore, it is in and through Li that we find the concreteness and reality of Ren, of which the master said, love your fellow men. This love, however, as we have previously discussed, finds its moral balance with the virtue of Yi, which gives Li its form. Now, the sage is never sullied. The Zhunzi is never sullied. That is why the call of the master Kong or Kongzi is for the man of Ren to enter public office. To ignore this call is to ignore one's duty. So long as he has run, even if he serves in virtue of E, he is never or he is not sullied. Now, as the master said, the gentleman seeks, he seeks within himself. What the gentleman seeks, he seeks within himself. What the small man seeks, he seeks in others. Regardless thus of the external disorder present in society, the Chunzi finds calmness and serenity within himself. Another passage which supports this is when he said, the master or the gentleman is at ease without being arrogant. The small man is arrogant without being at ease. So for Confucius, we are at the second bullet point now. For Confucius, the solution to chaos and disorder is not outright refusal. That is marked by the hermit's or mystic's withdrawal from society. And often, unfortunately, that is how Chinese philosophy is depicted, as a hermit or a mystic. Like, if you look at this picture of Confucius, it's almost as if, he's just spouting words of wisdom in his little corner. But that's not the call of Confucius. The call of Confucius is, again, not a withdrawal in society, but neither is it to succumb to it, but rather is a courage to fight the system in spite of the system. Because as for putting the way into practice, the Chunzi knows all along, as for putting the way into practice, the Chunzi knows all along that it is hopeless. Yet even then, the Chunzi stands above this impossibility because no matter what circumstance, the purity of his character would remain untarnished. And although Confucius acknowledges that it would take a generation, even for like the most noble of them all, it is worth doing what is right simply because it is the right thing to do. Now, in fact, the following passage, or this another passage that suggests that it is not the Chunzi who is influenced, rather it is he who is influenced with his strength of will, is found in, if you're interested, this is in Analects chapter 4, verse 5. And it says, the master wanted to settle amongst the 9 barbarian tribes of the East. And that's Confucius. And he wanted to settle among the 9 barbarians of the East. Someone said, but could you put up with their uncouth ways? The master said, once a gentleman settles amongst them, what uncouthness will there be? So he's actually saying that, it's not me who's going to change for the barbarians. It's them who's going to, because it's me who will try to teach them the ways of the noble man and ritual and propriety, as well as moral virtue. So if the Chunzi is a man of internal calmness and strength, unsullied and unfettered, why the need for refinement? Why the need to show others if he is in himself secure of his internal character? A disciple of the master asked this as well. This is Chi Zicheng. He said, the important thing about the gentleman is the stuff he is made of. What does he need refinement for? And Zikong commented, it is a pity that the gentleman should have spoken so about the gentleman. A team of horses cannot catch up with one's tongue. The stuff is no different from refinement, and refinement is no different from the stuff. The pelt of a tiger or a leopard, shorn of hair, is no different from that of a dog or sheep. Now, it is indeed because of what is inside must necessarily show outside. The awareness of Ren must necessarily be followed by its expression in Li, with E as its form, or with rightness as its form. Now, the Chunzi, thus, is a man of Ren, of E, perfected and refined, that is precisely made a Chunzi through the practice of Li. All this is in him when he practices Li to perfection, because the master said, virtue never stands alone. It is bound to have neighbors. So it's this complex set of web wherein you can't just have one virtue, but in order for it to actually be effective, it has to have the other virtues. Indeed, the primary Confucian virtues cannot each stand alone. So Ren, Yi, Li cannot stand alone in their own. All of them are connected and interdependent upon each other. Moreover, Confucius says that the gentleman is no vessel, meaning that the Chunzi is no specialist designed for a specific purpose. He is the embodiment of all virtues, and because all virtues comes from Tian or heaven, therefore it necessarily follows that the Chunzi is the embodiment of Tian. Now, again, something to take note here is that Tian in Confucianism doesn't mean supernatural or God. It's simply more apt with the natural way or the Tao. Closer to the Tao, the natural way, not really nature as is, or but more like the proper way, the proper moral virtues, the proper prescriptives. So as Wing Tse Chan notes, the sage aspires to become heaven. So, and you can see this even in the primary book of divination, which is what I worked on during my master's. It's called the I Ching, or the Book of Changes, that man tries to model himself on from heaven, which simply is like, the correct way of dealing with the world, of transacting with the world. And that again changes within each moment in time. And so Wing Tse Chan says that the sage aspires to become heaven, the worthy aspires to become a sage, and the gentleman aspires to become worthy. This is also why in the last passage of the Lunyu, Confucius said, a man has no way of becoming a gentleman unless he understands Ming or destiny. He has no way of taking his stand unless he understands the rights. And destiny here is again just, the times, unless he understands the times. It's not fixed like a teleological thing. So he has no way of taking his stand unless he understands the rights. He has no way of judging men unless he understands words. Man is again, therefore, cultivated by Li, and by understanding Li, gains the ability for the expression of Ren and his firmness of character towards the direction of Yi, the ideal of objective morality cemented by the existence of community. It is, however, in the following verse in the Lunyu where Li would stand as a very place where Chunzi is cultivated, despite Li being a supplementary instrument to both Ren and Yi. Now, we are in the last bullet point now. Tzu Chang said, one can perhaps be satisfied with a gentleman who is ready to lay down his life in the face of danger, who does not forget what is right at the sight of gain, and who does not forget reverence during a sacrifice, nor sorrow while in mourning. If one is able to follow Yi through Li, one is also able to uphold Ren because he is also aware of his Yi. This is most concretely mentioned in the Lunyu. Here we can see when the master said, the gentleman, widely versed in culture, but brought back to essentials by the rights, can, I suppose, be relied upon, not to turn against what he stood for, because he practices what he preaches, as we say in English. Now, Ren, therefore, is the root and most important virtue of Confucian philosophy, which precludes the moral system of the master. But it is counterbalanced as well as complemented by Yi. And this interplay of love and discipline, Ren and Yi as love and discipline, is perfected by the Chunzi, a man of Li, who in doing the proper rituals and social conduct also shows his ability to empathize with and respect others, as well as his ability to fulfill his moral duty to society as a good citizen and member of the community. By carrying within it necessarily all the other virtues, Li becomes a locus for the cultivation of Chunzi, the perfection of man as a moral project, able to express Ren, able to understand and work towards E. So that's my presentation or lecture for today. And I hope that even though it was slightly technical in its Chinese terms, as is as is necessary or as is unavoidable, I hope that I have somehow, at least at the very slightest, convinced you that propriety is very underrated in society today, and it's something that's important, and we should reconsider. So thank you for inviting me today to give you this lecture. It's my pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Tan, for your very informative and mind-stimulating lecture. So I suppose our audience now have so many questions regarding the lecture, but we are going to have a 5-minute break before the question and answer portion. So for the audience here in Zoom, you can input your questions in the live chat, and for those who are streaming in Facebook as well, you can input your questions in the live chat. So for the 5-minute break, let us allow us to consolidate your questions. Okay, so it's 11:08. Probably we can be back by 11:15 to proceed with the question and answer. And also, may I remind everyone to answer the feedback form. I'll be pasting the link here. Okay. Thank you again, Dr. Tan. Just a clarification for the audience. The questions will be entertained in the Q&A portion. In the Q&A portion, which can be viewed in your, I think, on your end. Okay, thank you. Um, we are, I suppose we can begin now with entertaining the questions. All right. So, Dr. Tan, for the first question, we have how may we find relevance of the ethical principles of Ren, Li, and Yi, or let's just say Chinese humanism and the current state of affairs in Chinese communities worldwide, or at least in societies like China or Taiwan? So that's the first question.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Now, this is kind of a tricky question because my personal view is that Confucianism doesn't embody the actual culture of maybe, say, China or even Taiwan. But there would, of course, be scholars who will argue that they do, and that Chinese culture is Confucian culture. But I think it's more complex than that. Chinese philosophy is extremely diverse. I personally work on a small, it's not very widely read in Anglophone philosophy, but it is quite a big thing in the history of Chinese philosophy, like neo-Taoism. So there's also Taoism, there's legalism, there's Moism, and there's even like it could even be argued that the first anarchist philosophy came from China, but that's a different conversation altogether. But so yeah, and when you look at China today, it's also Marxism is a Western import, and in Taiwan it's very liberal. So, and liberalism is a Western import. So I don't think I could really answer that question with justice, because again, I think that these countries are very complex politically, and they do have something to do with philosophy and some of the cultural imports, but it's not monolithic, let's say.
Okay, I hope that answers the question. Just a reminder to the audience, we will conduct this forum for only 35 minutes, so we might not be able to cater all the questions. So, for the next question, we have um, a question from Mr. Sigia. Within my social group, traditional values are not taken that seriously because of the liberal ideologies from the West. How do we position propriety in a better light within a pro-liberal society?
Yeah, thank you. I think that liberalism actually does not contrast that much with Confucian philosophy. So there are many liberal philosophers. Among them is one of the most prominent ones is someone who I look up to, and someone here. Her name is Sorhun Tan. So she works on Confucianism and liberalism. And a lot of these scholars, they think that Confucianism is, also pluralistic in nature. And we can just, because liberalism is a framework which allows for different kinds of values. And so the normative theory upon which the normative ethical theory upon which Confucianism belongs, which is virtue ethics, is not really that, it's not contradictory to liberalism. But again, I guess something that's different or something that's prominent in Confucianism is the highlight or the emphasis on propriety. And that's something that I think is not contradictory with liberal philosophy or with liberal politics, that, there could be freedom, there could be liberty with propriety, but it's simply the manner in which we conduct ourselves. And I think with Western culture, or with Western culture, that's also kind of a vague monolithic term. I think the emphasis mostly is on, like, when you disagree with someone, the criticisms are, it's not, it's usually framed, or there's a kind of stereotype where we think that critical thinking or criticizing people needs to always be something negative, or it's, when you're a critical thinker, or when you're a thinker or an intellectual, you could do it in, what is right, whatever. I don't need to um, look at my behavior, or at least even in the stereotype of the mad genius, right? We have this kind of intellectual type where behavior is not important at all. But in Confucianism, those go together. You can say that you're very intelligent if you're not behaving in an intelligent way. As an educated person who is moral, that as an educated person, you have the responsibility to also be moral. So I guess that answers the question a little bit, hopefully.
Okay, yeah. For our next question, we have from the chair of the Department of Philosophy and History, Professor Nella Florendo. Um, so here's the question. For some historians, the concept of Chudzu, which associated with the Chinese gentry and the corresponding Confucian virtues, reinforced the feudal structure of the period of the Zhou and the next dynasties. What do you think about this? If the Ren, Li, and Yi belong to the Chunzu, the gentleman, what virtues belong to the peasant or the Xiaojian?
Hold on, let me just read that question again. Um, Oh, okay. So thank you for that. That's actually a very interesting question. And yes, indeed, Confucianism was misused definitely more than a lot of times in Chinese intellectual history as well. And a very one of the most prominent ones would be, so in during the Han Dynasty, Confucianism became the actual primary form of. So the government adopted Confucianism as its like ethical framework, and towards the end of that, it was misused a lot, which is what gave birth to Neo-Taoism. And then that movement emphasized or claimed that they were just reminding everyone that actually, if we are talking about real Confucianism, real filial piety, it's not just, whoever is close to you, or whoever, or just empty virtues. And that's the highlight of, I think that's one of the highlights of the presentation of my lecture today as well, to remind that propriety is not something that is fixed, and it comes with education. So everybody is or can be a chunzi, and it can indeed propagate, or it can reinforce the feudal structure. But in a Confucian society, and you may disagree with this or not, and I personally find myself quite ambivalent to it, but it's supposed to be a meritocratic society. So there's nothing wrong with hierarchy. There's nothing wrong with having people on top and having some on the bottom. But the point is that the people on top needs to be able to earn it. And you can see that, I guess this just going back to the question earlier as well. So in Singapore, for example, and in China, although, you can say it's you can say some questionable things, but it's very difficult to get into the CCP, for example. It requires so much education, and Chinese politicians are among the best educated. It might work, it might not, but that's something that we see. And it's something that prevents a Donald Trump, for example. So, yeah, I guess that's how I would answer that.
Okay, I hope that answers your question, Ma'am Nella. Okay, so for our next question, we have Mr. Blanza. He asks, I noticed that the idea of Ren is similar to Aristotelian virtue ethics. I was just wondering, why do different cultures arrive at a very similar ideas of virtue?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it is a lot of there are a lot of studies that compare Confucian virtue ethics with Aristotelian ones. Of course, another thing is that it's very similar is kind of like the golden rule, and you see this in Confucius as well. The balance is always the key, and I think that's something interesting to note, something that's quite beyond my scope, because I don't really specialize in ancient Greek philosophy. But yeah, I think that is interesting to note that different cultures can sometimes arrive at very similar ideas. And another thing that's very similar as well is, in Aristotle, you first find the idea of democracy, right? And with Confucianism, people often try to frame it as authoritarian, but it's actually it um, it's a very early form of something similar to democracy would also be found in Confucianism, even before Aristotle. And this is the idea of what we call Tianming, or the mandate of heaven. And the mandate of heaven is decided by the populace, by the people. So that's kind of a mandate by the people for something that also shows us a government by the people for the people. So yeah, there are similarities, and that's interesting to note.
Okay. We still have time. So for the next question from an anonymous attendee, if by nobleman refers to a person who is expressing Ren through Li in the form of Yi, can all ages reach the level of Junzi? Are children or one's childhood or early teen adult life experiences exempted? If no, we must also consider that humans are not perfect beings. We must commit mistakes. By then, is the process of being a Junzi compromised as the virtue of Ren is compromised?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, which is taken up by Confucian disciples later on, actually. And for example, there's Mencius and Shunzi, later on Confucian scholars, and Mencius argued that actually children are naturally run, but they are naturally run or they're naturally benevolent. And we can see that from our instincts. Like if someone is about to fall into a well, your first instinct is to help that person regardless of education or not. But there's also Shunzi, who emphasizes more on education and culture, and I find myself more inclined towards Shunzi personally, because he highlights the need for education and the need for enculturation in order for us to be able to be moral. And it is through that education that we acquire morality and become a chunzi. And that's not something that's very just unique to this, at least this particular aspect is not unique to Confucius, and something that we see, for example, in Hannah Arendt as well, in The Banality of Evil, where Eichmann says that I was simply following orders, and the greatest of evil is from people who are small men, or those who cannot think, those who are not educated enough to actually reevaluate their actions. And yes, children can sometimes be, children more often than not don't have the capability to look back and reevaluate their actions, which is why we must educate them, which is also highlighted in a different work by Confucius called 大学, or the Great Learning. So yeah.
Okay. For our next question, we have Miss Angeles. Okay. So Ren, Lee, and Lee emphasize praxis, concretization, and actualization of what is internal. So how can these concepts be applied in Philippine culture and society? Please cite examples.
Can you repeat that question? I can't see it.
Okay. So Ren, Lee, and Yi emphasize praxis, the concretization, actualization of what is internal. How can these concepts be applied in Philippine culture and society?
I haven't really thought about that, to be honest. But well, Lee and E is the practice of what is internal, and Run is the internal one. So it's your motivation to do good, and then Lee is what is right in that moment. So that what's right would always change in each circumstance in time. So I guess maybe an example would be um, obeying your parents. So it would be proper. It's according to propriety to obey your parents, and that's something that we also have, or is very much highlighted in Filipino culture, and that's a Lee, but then it's not fixed. It's just grammar, because E is always something that allows you to know what is right in that circumstance. And so what they're asking you to obey is more often than not what's right, but sometimes it can also be what isn't. And so you have to work your way through that and rethink or reevaluate on what is the proper course of action, while not just obeying them passively, but also disagreeing while being respectful. So I guess that's a small example of what it could look like in Filipino culture.
Okay. For our next question, we have here Miss Flores. She asks, it is the case for Confucianism to overcome the true self to become a better person. Does this mean that Confucianism implies that we are inherently immoral?
That's a very I think that's a very good question. So it could imply that we are inherently immoral, or that we are inherent not even it doesn't necessarily imply that we're inherently immoral, but that if we don't try to become moral, we'll slide off to being immoral. So the consensus among scholars is that Confucianism, the general consensus is that it doesn't really, like the Analects doesn't really talk about it. And it's later on in Mencius and Shunzi where we find that they actually claim that it's inherently good or inherently bad. But the common thing, or the common thread between them, is that if we do not cultivate our virtues, we will slide off into being immoral. And cultivating your virtues, of course, takes effort, and that's where overcoming your true self becomes or overcoming what we often understand as the true self, when we don't let society teach us what is right and wrong. That's where the effort and overcoming it comes in. A scholar who talks about this in great lengths is Michael Pewitt. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend his videos. It's very accessible and he's a great speaker. So Michael Pewitt talks about this a lot, and he compares Confucian authentic, the modern sense of authentic self versus Confucian propriety and ritual.
Okay. Let's have another question. So here, there's a question from another attendee. It was mentioned by Feng Yulan in the discussion of Chong and Shu that one must use himself in order to be able to gauge his own conduct. Does not limiting assessments to the self hinder being able to attain the fullness of Ren, since focus is put on the self and not on what we can learn from others? Mm,
Yeah, so it if you look at it in a perspective of there is an objective principle of what is right, then maybe yes. But the point of Confucius is that there is no objective principle like you see in like Kantian categorical imperative. That's unrealistic. We grow up in certain contexts, and we encounter people from, I guess, especially that's there's some difficulty in that in a very globalized world now, but from like a localized perspective, we grow up in certain contexts, and we learn how, what we grow up in, the culture that we are brought up in, and that's the language or that's the grammar that we transact within. And so that's the only realistic context that you can use. I mean, in a Confucian perspective, something like the trolley problem wouldn't make sense. So, if you have this, like, what's the right thing to do in this specific scenario, of regardless of your cultural context, no one stands there and thinks, in a real situation, in a real scenario, you don't stand up in front of an oncoming train and think, oh my God, what would Kant do in this situation? Or what is the Kantian thing to do in this situation? That's not the case in very practical philosophies like Confucianism. We actually are realistic about, or they are realistic about what we can expect from people to do and to follow and to embed, to habituate themselves doing, so that it will work in as kind of a guiding principle for all times. Yeah.
okay. I hope that answers your question. So for our next one, it is asked, it has been noted that Junzi should be the one to ultimately lead and form the nation's ideals. Does that cultivates an elitist thinking in a way that it excludes people from contributing and participating in forming their nation?
Yeah. Confucianism is, I wouldn't say elitist, but it is inherently meritocratic. And we often have a problem with that because when we say meritocratic, the standards, it's very difficult to gauge standards. It's very difficult to gauge what is merit. But that's why it can often, it is, kind of flimsy to work with. But at the same time, Confucianism doesn't have a problem with just straight up meritocracy if we can assure that those at the top actually are educated. I think in an age like today, there's again, admittedly, a lot more difficulty because of things like social media, the internet, and brainwashing, and psychological psychologically um, big data and psychological manipulation. But from like a simpler perspective, Confucianism doesn't have a problem with elitism and meritocracy. That's the idea that motivates it, because we are, for Confucianism, it's not even as far, like, I think if you look at Plato, the philosopher should only be king. It's a lot more, watered down. Confucianism is a lot more watered down than Plato's Republic. But yes, there is an aspect to it where only educated people, we should be governed by educated people. We should be governed by people who know what they're doing. And we shouldn't allow um, people who are not educated enough, or who are not morally educated enough to be able to govern us politically, socially. And it is important that, the that someone who governs us is virtuous and not someone who has profit in their mind. And yes, it excludes some people from being allowed to govern, because they are not um, not morally cultivated, or not moral enough, because they have profit in their mind, as small men do. Yeah.
This will probably be our last question. So, um, he asks here, she asks here, as a society that is influenced heavily by Western ideologies of individualism and success, in yourself, how do we reconcile Confucian principles in today's world, as it is structured heavily in hierarchy and authority?
Sorry, what? Higher.
Hierarchy and authority.
Yeah, so I think that we don't need to wholesale adopt Confucianism, but it is useful to rethink Confucianism's merits to society. You know, I guess it's not really in all of the world that individualism is highlighted. And even if so, maybe we need to rethink that, especially as the pandemic has happened, especially as COVID-19 has happened. Maybe we need to reconsider whether that's working for us. That kind of culture, this kind of mindset or framework, is it working for us? And what can we do? Or are there more plausible options? Are there more plausible ways to actually deal with the reality that we are situated in? And the reality is that I think we do need to reconsider some of those frameworks, some of those values that Western liberal society has, and consider non-mainstream or non-Western alternatives, such as Confucian ethics sometimes, so that, because it's not a one size fits all. Ethics, morality, political philosophy, and social philosophy, I don't think should be a one size fits all, as we see in our globalized society. So there is merit in considering alternative philosophies and alternative frameworks, such as those that are more relational, those that acknowledge that we always live and are thrown in a community, and that communities build up our identities in reality, and that we are not isolated individuals who form our values from nothing and are transcendent in society. So yeah, we are in a community, and it's probably time that we should start acknowledging that.
Okay. All right. So that ends our forum, and we thank the audience for participating. Um, for this portion, we now proceed to the awarding of the certificate. So, Ma'am Karen, can you share the certificate so I can read the contents? Okay. Um, this certificate of appreciation is awarded to Dr. Christine Abigail L. Tan for sharing her invaluable knowledge as resource speaker for the cultured man as a nobleman, Chunsi as a man of Li and Lunyu as part of Ethics 1 Guest Lectures 2021, given this 10th day of May 2021, signed by Professor Vladimir Kevin D. Bumatay, Assistant Professor of Philosophy, College of Social Sciences, UP Baguio, and Professor Aureliano A. Colong- Colongon, um, Dean, College of Social Sciences, UP Baguio. So, thank you very much, Dr. Tan, for accepting our invitation and for giving us this very informative lecture. Um, okay. Uh, for now, we are, I suppose. Okay. So for now, we are going to have our break. So that concludes our morning session. We are now going to have an hour of break before proceeding to the next portion. So I'll I'm reminding again everyone to answer the feedback form, and for the next session, please refer to the Zoom link as I think given to you by your professors or sent to you by the UP system email. So to my co-panelists, um, we are should we now conclude finally our event? Okay. Um,
Yes, Ma'am
and
Andy and Ma'am Tin. So thank you po again, Ma'am Tin, for accepting our invitation and for sharing to us your expertise on confusion ethics.
thank you.
So we can end on the webinar at this point and invite our participants to attend the afternoon webinar. Thank you everyone and happy lunch.
Thank you.